Um, well, let me just get started, and the room will populate further as we go along. I want to just welcome the audience. Some of you are repeat offenders and have been in these chats before, but we've made a practice at SAPIR to ask at least some of our writers to talk about the essays that they have done for us, and we've had really a very distinguished roster of people. I'm not sure if we've had anyone more distinguished than Andrew Roberts. I noticed when the SAPIR invitation went out, it described you as one of Britain's most distinguished historians. This is false. You are one of the world's most distinguished historians. And I have some of the evidence. This masterpiece, described by the New York Times as the best single volume biography of Churchill, appeared, I think, in 2018, at the end of 2018. You've written extensively about Napoleon. Your most recent book is about George III, the last king of America. And am I allowed to say this? Are you working, or at least considering, a biography of
Disraeli?
Of
yes.
Disraeli.
However, I think there's going to be a book in between that. I'm going to be doing a book for next year, actually, which I don't want to talk about yet because I haven't signed the contract yet, and I'm very superstitious about that kind of thing.
Okay, so that's why I was a little hesitant to mention.
Yeah, the big book, though, the next sort of 4 years of my life after Christmas will be working on this extraordinary man, Disraeli, who somehow, despite being Jewish, became the prime minister of the largest empire the world's ever seen, at a time when a lot of the conservatives and the upper classes were anti-Semitic. So it's an extraordinary story. So
we're going to get to your essay, but I just want to pause right there, because in a sense it bears on exactly what we're going to discuss, which is, how was it that a largely anti-Semitic British aristocracy in an era that was far less democratic than Britain is today, and I don't just mean not having women voting, how were they able to overcome that particular bigotry and allow Disraeli to be, next to Palmerston and just a handful of other people, the great British Prime Minister of the 19th century, the zenith of empire?
It was largely because they needed him. It wasn't out of any fondness for his background, certainly. He, through his own brilliance and his wit and his capacity for political maneuvering in one sense, but also his wonderful oratory in another, were able to he was able to persuade them that he was the only man who could, as you say, take on Palmerston, but also Gladstone and other liberals, and actually bring a majority of the electorate over to the Conservatives. So it was a marriage of convenience at the beginning, but slowly, as he did well, and as he won the great general election of 1874, he actually became beloved by the Tory party, and especially so after he died.
It's in that sense, there's an interesting parallel, I think, with Winston Churchill, who also became prime minister over the objection of his own party, not least as a maverick outsider, though obviously, himself a descendant of British aristocracy. But I want to get to this wonderful essay that you have done for our 5th issue of SAPIR, which is beginning to emerge on our website now. It's sapirjournal.org. We will have the physical edition fairly soon. And it's what Britain can learn from Israel. And you begin your essay by taking note of the degree of condescension and vitriol that populates kind of the upper circles of most of British intelligentsia, not all of it by any means, but much of British intelligentsia, much, especially the British Foreign Office and the BBC, which if you lived in Israel would always find you tearing your hair out at the way in which they reported things. But start with the Foreign Office. Why has there been, really since well before 1948, before independence, this long-standing animosity by the Foreign Office for a state project that is in many ways the child of a British foreign minister, at least from a generation before?
Well, that's exactly right, Bret. It does predate the creation of the State of Israel in May 1948. I think quite a lot of it goes back to the Arabism of the First World War, the romance of the Lawrence of Arabia story. If you talk to ambassadors today, they'll say, well, look, it's nothing to do with anti-Semitism at all. It's all to do with the fact that there are 22 Arab countries and only one Jewish one. And Britain's interests, therefore, are better served by essentially having good relations with the 22 countries rather than the one. If you scrape into that a little bit more carefully, and also point out, as I do to these ambassadors, that actually if Israel's able to, through the Abraham Accords, for example, have perfectly reasonable relations with some Arab countries, why on earth couldn't Britain be a bit more positive about Israel? You'll find a profound historical dislike. And as you say, actually more than dislike, really a condescension. This idea that it's a brand new country, it's only 70 years old, which means a lot. Actually, 70 years is a long time in the history of a nation, as Lord Salisbury said, but not as far as the Foreign Office is concerned. It seems like an interloper that just causes endless trouble for Britain and the West and the rest of the world. That's the way that the Foreign Office still, even to this day, considers the State of Israel. And it strikes me that after such a long time, there's virtually nothing one can do about it. This is true for Conservative governments. Boris Johnson, who is tremendously pro-Israel, and many of his ministers, Priti Patel, for example, these are essentially Priti's a Zionist, and yet it still doesn't get through to the upper reaches of the civil service, especially in the Foreign Office. So it's just there, like some appalling incubus, and I don't know what can be done about it.
So you have to sort of scratch your head and wonder what rewards exactly Britain has reaped by its effort to have better relations with Israel's enemies than with Israel itself. But you did indicate that there is a change, at least in this government. Is there any hope for that change to be sustained, or is this government so unpopular that its somewhat Zionist sympathies would just fall into the another reason to dislike the current government?
Well, I'm not as convinced as everybody else seems to be that this government is quite so unpopular, frankly. The New York Times in particular has had you mentioned earlier, a very nice quote about the New York Times about one of my books. And so therefore, which needless to say is pretty much the only thing I agree with the New York Times about. What it's said recently about Britain, it seems to have this extraordinary Anglophobia at the moment. And largely, I think this is because it makes the complete mistake of equating Boris Johnson with Donald Trump. Apart from their hair, I don't think that they have that much in common, frankly. There are any number of ideological differences between them, but the New York Times has got this idea that they're the same person, and therefore it endlessly attacks the Johnson government. I think this is wildly overblown. Look, every midterm government has unpopular moments. These local elections, which the New York Times has made out to be an absolute catastrophe for Boris, actually he did less badly than he was expected to by most political commentators. And there are some seats, especially in the Midlands and the north of England, where he won from Labour. So, it's not as bad as it's made out. That said, yes, the pro-Israel stance of the Conservative Party, rather ever since Margaret Thatcher, in fact, this isn't just true of Boris. It was true in Margaret Thatcher's day as well, but not sadly in between terribly much. It is something that's used against the Conservatives. And I'm afraid, again, a bit like with Disraeli, that in the end it just comes down to sheer politics. There are, I'm not sure the exact number, but it's something like 10 times more Muslim voters in the British electorate than there are Jewish voters. And as a result, the Labour Party has very much reckoned that it will skew that way. Of the 11 Labour MPs who are Muslims, I'm afraid no fewer than 10 of them are influenced in some way or another by the Islamists. So, yeah, exactly. It's an extraordinary political fact, but a very unpleasant one. But if you just come down to psephology, it makes more sense for a British politician essentially to suck up to his Muslim constituents than his Jewish ones. And that also, needless to say, has a political effect, but luckily not one that so far has managed to infiltrate the Conservative Party to any degree.
Let me ask you, Andrew, and by the way, I should just pause here and say to those of you who are listening in, as questions, as things Andrew says inspire questions or comments, please add them in the chat function at the bottom of the Zoom or in the Q&A function, and I hope to get to them at in the second half of our conversation. I want to ask you about the Labour Party, because obviously it's just come through this this period in which the brand name of the Labour Party increasingly became associated with not just virulent anti-Zionism, but outright anti-Semitism. But this also has historic precedents. When Israel came into being, there was a Labour government in Britain. In the United States, obviously the similarities between the Democratic Party and the Labour government aren't exact, but the left of center government in the United States, Harry Truman's administration, instantly recognized Israel. Truman took great pride in being, as he put it, Cyrus to the Jews and returning them to their homeland. This was not the case with the government of Attlee. And just help us understand what the mindset was of the Attlee government in 47 and 48, and why there has been this persistent, although I don't think uniform, Gordon Brown calls himself pro-Israel, Tony Blair thought of himself as pro-Israel, but still a kind of really uniform Labour anti-Zionism from the earliest days of Israel right until the Corbyn era.
Yes, well, of course, you're right. In fact, only last week I was in the Harry Truman Library in Kansas City, a really enjoyable trip there, and I saw the actual piece of paper that with Truman's signature, recognizing the state of Israel 11 minutes after its foundation in May 1948. So, so you're right about that. By total contrast, the Labour government of Clement Attlee, and especially its Foreign Secretary Ernest Bevin, were so negative actually about Israel that in December 1948 they warned Israel that if Israel didn't take its troops out of the Negev desert, that Britain might well declare war on the side of the Egyptians. Obviously, it took 8 years before they realized that they'd chosen precisely the wrong side. And in the Suez crisis, the next government swapped sides.
That was back in conservative hands with Anthony.
It was Anthony Eden, of course, by then, exactly. But Anthony Eden until 1956 was pretty anti-Semitic. When you read the diaries of Evelyn Shuckburgh, his private secretary, you can't get away from that. Then he completely changed his mind at the time of the Suez crisis, which of course was one of the great crises of his life and his premiership. But the Labour government, again, because it saw Israel as a not just destructive thing in the Middle East, phenomenon in the Middle East, but also a long-term dangerous one to its own Britain's own position there. It wasn't really until we started to bring troops out of the east of Suez in 1966 that we were able to recognize that Israel posed no danger at all, no threat at all to what was then no longer the British Empire. And we were able to, at least the Conservatives were able to look at it in a much more positive light. Unfortunately, this didn't really happen with Labour. Now, look, I'm a Conservative myself, so I don't want to just use this opportunity to bash Labour. And there are a lot of very good things that Sir Keir Starmer, the new Labour leader, have done to root out anti-Semitism. Firstly, of course, he's actually thrown Jeremy Corbyn out of the party. What he should have done, of course, is to also throw several other Corbynites out of the party as well. So you do still get a lot of Corbynites within the Labour Party causing trouble. But on the Jewish issue, on the anti-Semitism issue, the Corbynites are very much in the retreat. And Sir Keir Starmer, who is a decent man and in no sense an anti-Semite, has done a very good job. The question is whether or not he's going to survive. He's got his own Partygate scandal going on at the moment. He has not cut through enormously, especially in those local elections. Labour Party is still at only 35% when it comes to people polling. And so the battle is far from over within the Labour Party. You know, it could be that you get a Corbynite revival, especially in the constituency level, that means that this Frankenstein returns from the dead, as it were.
So I want to touch on now your essay, because it really was fascinating to me. And Britain finds itself at a kind of a peculiar moment in its history. It is at last out of the European Union. It has not managed, at least in terms of trade relations, to hammer down to hammer out a trade agreement, a free trade agreement with the United States, which I know is an aspiration for Johnson. Outside of the European Union, it has more independence, more leeway, but on the other hand, you might also argue more risk. So the title of your piece is What Britain Can Learn from Israel. What is it that Britain has not been doing for the past 50 years that Israel has, and that Britain ought to learn again to do?
Well, before I answer that, can I just say that there's one area that you touched on there, which I think is tremendously important, that I think that your viewers might be interested in, which of course is the foreign policy aspect of Brexit. It very much strikes me that one of the reasons, beyond the moral and obvious strategic ones, that Boris Johnson was the first Western leader to come out in support of Zelensky, not just verbally, but in terms of actually sending arms. And in terms of population, we have given more arms and more useful arms than any other country apart from America. So there's I think one of the reasons for that was Brexit, was because Johnson very much wanted to be able to show that a post-Brexit Britain was able to take firm and at that stage independent stances that are removed from the French and German stances, which only very much caught up with the pro-Ukraine movement later. Yeah. So I think Brexit was very good as far as Ukraine was concerned. To get on to your major point, what Britain can learn, or at least what it hasn't learned from the last half century, I can sum it up in 2 words. Since Margaret Thatcher, at least, since the fall of Margaret Thatcher in November 1990, we haven't had the same kind of attitude as Israel over the 2 words, free market. With regard to the kind of technological innovation that is happening in Israel, with its extraordinary high-tech startups. This is just something that that Britain is still tiptoeing behind. It's got the setup, especially at Cambridge in England, but it doesn't have that essential prerequisite, which is a feeling that competition and the free market and all the positive things that go with that are naturally, in and of themselves, a good thing. And you do find that with Israel, not across the board in Israel. Obviously, there are political strands of political thought that totally do not agree with that at all. But in Israel, you have had a prime minister in Benjamin Netanyahu who totally personifies that attitude, in my view, and also a lot of other politicians who believe it too. So this is something that I'm afraid we are miles behind.
Well, there's another aspect which I want to ask you about, which is identity. Obviously, within Israel, there are at least a half dozen, if not a dozen, sub-identities. But there is a real sense of not just a Jewish, but a distinctly Israeli identity that is reinforced by common institutions, particularly a national service in the military, and genuine enemies. Britain used to have that very clear sense of identity, along with a kind of a real martial prowess or vigor. It has dissipated. Now, Brexit is arguably the first step in reversing that, but it doesn't seem to me that that's something that's so easily recaptured. And my question is, are you optimistic that this sense of a distinctly British identity, a kind of a deep pride in the differences that make Britain unique, as opposed to what simply makes it another European nation, whether that sense of pride and identity is still there, and can it be recaptured and amplified?
I think it is still there, absolutely. I think that it's undoubtedly under threat and has been for a long time. Of course, in a sense, Israel's had to pay an enormous price with your 5 major invasions of your country to solidify this sense of a national national identity, which obviously Britain hasn't had. But when we do see conflict, the classic example, of course, being the Falklands War in 1982, there was an identifiable coming together of the nation, which I think you also see in some other moments. The Olympics, for example, was another time when a good deal of national pride was shown. But it's so unwoke and politically incorrect to show national pride under almost any other circumstance than sport that there's a problem with that. I think that the kind of national identity that Israel has is something that Britain would do very well to try to emulate. And this has, of course, got nothing to do with race in Britain, which is one of the major ways in which Britain has changed since the 1970s. National identity is not involved at all with racial identity. It's to do with so many other really important aspects of the way in which the British people respond to things. And as you say, Brexit, I think, setting ourselves independent of the European Union is an opportunity which I think the government should do everything to try to grasp in order to underline those areas of our national life that are separate and different. Not necessarily better or worse, by the way, but just our own.
So the ism that we are discussing is nationalism, and Israel has always had. I mean, it is the quintessential, maybe the original nation state that precedes every other nation state that I can think of, in the fact that you map ethnic and even religious identity, linguistic identity, cultural identity on political identity, the nation and the state. And nationalism has become probably the most contentious issue in 21st century politics, where a good segment of the public, particularly I think on the political left, simply conflates nationalism with a kind of racism, or at least a chauvinism. Now, there's something to that. There are racist and chauvinist strains of nationalism. But it seems increasingly true as well that, with the possible exception of the United States, which is sui generis in many ways, most countries are based on a nation state concept. And what is it that, first of all, that Britain needs to do to recapture a kind of a healthy sort of nationalism if it doesn't have it? And how do you advocate for this? What lessons does Israel offer to Britain that you think are useful in thinking about the construction of a nationalistic character that doesn't fall prey to various sorts of bigotries?
Well, of course, you're absolutely right with regard to this this word nationalism. I mean, the word national was in the Nazi Party's official title, after all, and so it obviously does have a sort of Caliban style attitude to it. I therefore tend to try to avoid the term nationalism, because I think it has become degraded, and use instead patriotism, which doesn't imply, it just implies a love for one's own country, doesn't imply any kind of aggression or negative attitudes towards any other countries at all. And I think in terms of Britain learning from Israel, there's an enormous amount that one can learn from with regard to patriotism. Your country is tremendously patriotic. When I say your country, I mean Israel. I know you're an American, Bret, but you're essentially, it's so much your country as well. Israel is a patriotic country, and it's one that therefore I think can teach Britain quite a lot. I think one of the things that you do, which I think is important with regard to patriotism, is you are extremely tough on illegal immigration, and this is a problem we've got in England at the moment, with some 60,000 people a year projected to be crossing the English Channel over in some danger, and sometimes these small boats do sink, with tragic consequences. And what the Johnson government has proposed to do, is to actually take the illegal immigrants, and of course we have huge numbers of legal immigrants that nobody has any problem with whatsoever. Indeed, we're inviting tens of thousands of Ukrainians over to Britain as well. But with regard to the illegal ones, the people who are being trafficked, essentially, people smugglers who are making vast fortunes out of the misery of others, we're actually taking pretty tough action in the Conservative government over that. And I think that's a classic example of where a government can act patriotically, i.e. in the nation's best interests, but not nationalistically or chauvinistically in opposing any other nation's interests. And there are lots of other examples. In Israel you have and as I say, part of this is because of your continued threat that you get from your neighbours occasionally, on a regular basis, in fact, which of course we don't have. We might not get on terribly well with the French terribly much, but we're not in any fear that they might invade us.
But let me touch on that a little further. Obviously, there's the question of illegal immigration, which is a separate one, but there's also the question of legal immigration and the distinctly polyglot identity. I mean, whenever I'm in London, it really feels like it's not a part of England, that it's an entity unto itself, multi-ethnic, polyglot, genuinely a world city, and obviously something to be immensely proud of after New York, really the financial capital of the world, certainly the most important financial hub in Europe, the place where I think most immigrants would like to go if they can. Talk a little bit more about how effectively you can create a patriotic Britain in a polyglot society like that. And I'd be interested also in the educational aspect. You know, when Americans, my wife's an immigrant to the United States, and in a sense, when she took the oath of allegiance and became a citizen, George Washington became her president. You know, this entire history here that was not hers until she was in middle age suddenly becomes hers. It's very much a part of American identity. In Israel, even if you're an Argentinian Jew or from Polish or Canadian or whatever, that Jewish heritage binds you to distant Abrahamic ancestors. Is that possible in Britain today? Does a recent immigrant from, let's say, Ukraine arrive in Britain and look at the statue of Churchill outside of Parliament, or Disraeli or Gladstone or whoever, and say, these are now my prime ministers? Does it work quite the same way?
Well, first of all, I think it's very important not to mistake London for England, and certainly not London for the whole of the United Kingdom. London is a sui generis city, as you say. It's a tremendously cosmopolitan city. We're very lucky with our restaurants from all over the world, so on. But it's not the whole country. Actually, you see this a bit in these local elections that I mentioned a couple of times. London was almost a total clean sweep for Labour, even when Boris was doing well, as I say, in some seats in the Midlands and the North. So that's the first thing. The capital is I can't remember the exact numbers, but it's something like 1/3 of the people, or is it 40% of the people who live in London were not born in Britain, which is it's unusual for Britain, and certainly unusual for any other country. But I'm glad you mentioned your wife and George Washington, because of course the whole history side of things, and I'm not just saying this as an historian, I think I would say this even if I were not one, is a tremendously important one. And I noticed that the students of George Washington University in Washington, DC, according to the Washington Post, want to change the name of the university because they're so embarrassed about having a slave owner and a founding father as the name of their university. By the way, this was supported, I think, by the Washington Post. I'm wondering what the Washington Post is going to call itself after if the name Washington is going to be expunged from American history, or indeed what the District of Columbia are going to do.
This is the same Washington Post, I have to add in passing, that is busy editorializing about the evils of having Elon Musk, an unaccountable billionaire, take over a media platform like Twitter. I'm just putting that out there.
Remind me who owns the Washington Post. I can't remember.
That's what had me scratching my head.
Yeah. Now, now just to continue, I think that the history side of the what we're forced to call the culture wars now. We didn't start them, we didn't pick them, we didn't want them, but they have been forced upon us. And when one sees the statue of Jefferson being taken down in New York, or the repeated attacks on the statue of Churchill, not just in the Black Lives Matter demonstration, but in other demonstrations as well, you do recognize, I hope, that there is a real full-scale attack on national identity on both sides of the Atlantic, because people like Washington and Churchill are essential to understanding the nature of the countries. And so I've just been reading Douglas Murray's excellent book on the war on the West, And I think the points he's making about the centrality of history and history teaching and statues and so on is a very valid one, even though, of course, the left like to pretend whenever they lose a battle over a statue that it's all sort of created by the right. Simply isn't. We wouldn't be battling over statues if we were left to ourselves, because people like them. They're part of the natural, furniture of the nation.
You mentioned George Washington University, and that brings to mind the question of pedagogy and national identity. And here in the United States, the next issue of SAPIR, after our current issue on Zionism, is going to be devoted to the question of education. It has become an intensely political question because in our grade schools, high schools, and colleges, the very nature of our national identity as Americans, and the question of the intrinsic or at least overall on balance goodness of the American political enterprise is being very hotly contested. And my sense is that there is an analogous culture war taking place in Great Britain. Could you talk a little bit about that? And do you feel, I mean, here in the United States, at least among my circle of friends, there's intense pessimism about whether those of us who basically think that the United States is an exceptional and wonderful country that has done far more good than harm in the world, that we are losing the commanding heights of the culture. Is that true as well in Britain, or how is it playing out?
I think you're right that there is a tremendous pessimism. However, I'm not sure it's necessarily justified, actually, because there's a great way that that some councils in this country have actually been able to outmaneuver the whole putting down the statues movement, which is actually to give local people a voice. Every time there is an actual referendum, a local referendum, on whether a statue should be pulled down of, I know, Sir Francis Drake or Admiral Nelson or somebody in some town. And when you see also people being allowed to vote on whether or not their street name should continue to be called Imperial Way or, Colonial Avenue or something, slightly exaggerating those terms, but Cecil Rhodes, for example.
Yeah.
Every time
I've noticed that the Rhodes Scholarship has not changed its name.
No. Or have you also noticed how people are willing to take the vast amounts of money they get from their Rhodes Scholarship, whilst at the same time attacking the name Rhodes?
Right.
But yeah, exactly.
Prestige.
That's right. But as I say, the way to counter this is actually to use democracy, to use this amazing idea that America has expanded so much and also developed so much and exported to so much of the world. If you use that homegrown concept of yours, democracy,
it's yours too, by the way,
and apply it to your own selves in local elections, I think you'll find that local decisions about pulling down statues, I think you'll find that, as we have done in England, in all sorts of councils across the country, that actually local people don't like it. They want to live on the same street that they grew up in and call the name the same thing. They want to have connections to their parents and grandparents. They also don't feel the kind of self-hating guilt about Imperial Britain that they're supposed to, because Black Lives Matter tell them to. And they remember actually their grandfathers as having done rather good things for the rest of the world and to have been pretty altruistic. So in fact, I think that the key to fighting these cultural wars and perhaps winning them is to unleash that extraordinary idea of democracy that America's done so much to promote.
So that's actually, I think, an important and useful proposal. I don't think I've seen it mentioned anywhere in our own domestic debates about naming and statues. It has almost always been left to the votes of city councils or individual mayors as executive or legislative actions rather than referenda, which I suspect would change things a great deal. I'm going because we have less than 20 minutes to go in our conversation to turn it over to some of the questions from our audience. So let me start with Julian Cooper, who asks you, Andrew, can you touch upon how we have arrived at a point whereby Zionism is now conflated with being right-wing in a pejorative sense? It was initially arguably very much a left-wing invention, or at the very least fully supported by the left, the Manchester Guardian being one example. Any comment to Mr. Cooper?
Yes, I think it happened in 1967, or at least it started in 1967, when people started to see the Palestinians as being the downtrodden colonial people, and being oppressed, blah, blah, blah. You know, you can fill in the rest of it, frankly. Also, of course, by that stage, 25 years had passed, or at least 20 plus years had passed since the Holocaust. And so memories, and sad to say, were starting to dim. And you had this very much this sense that the left wanted to be on the side of the underdog, and the Jews were no longer seen in Palestine, at least, as the underdog after 1967 because of their tremendous victory in that war. So I think it's part of the left's sense of itself, self-identification with the Palestinian cause that has caused all the trouble. When you look into it, and you look into the way, of course, that Arab Israelis have lived since 1948, you recognise that, in fact, Zionism has been tremendously good for the well-being of the people of that region. All you get is a complete blank face, or you get anger, or you get BDS, or so on. So this is the mountain that Zionists have to climb in this country. And,
yeah, I mean, it's also the fact, I should add, that after 1967, the Soviet Union, through the weight not only of its military and diplomatic muscle, but also its propaganda arms into advancing the idea that Zionism is racism, and the influence of that, I think is underappreciated in terms of shaping ideological debates in the late Cold War, which really have just continued right through to the present. I have a question from Mr. Scott Lazensky. I'd like to ask you, Mr. Roberts, about the office of the chief rabbi and Ephraim Mervis. There is typically a focus here in North America on his extraordinary intervention in your last election, yet less attention is given to his extensive bridge building with UK Muslims, extending inroads Rabbi Sachs made. Can other Jewish communities, or even Israel, learn from the UK Jewish community and its leaders like Mervis how to better navigate cross-community ties? Of course, here in the United States, we do not have a chief rabbi, but it's an interesting feature of English Jewish life.
Well, that was going to be the first point that I made. You know, I was going to make. It's that the actual existence of the chief rabbi, the office of the chief rabbi, is in itself a unusual thing, and I think a very positive thing. I knew Jonathan Sachs very well. He went to my old college in Cambridge, and we won the Bradley Prize in the same day. And he was a tremendous, charming, intelligent, learned, articulate, eloquent, fine man. And I think that, yes, he did start this. But the trouble is, what we don't seem to recall is quite how many slaps in the face he got from not just from Islamists, you know, but from people who misinterpreted his overtures, and so I, of course, one must be in favour of these very fine and morally upstanding attempts to appeal across the aisle to Muslim sentiment. And there are huge numbers of Muslims who are more than willing to grasp an open hand if it's offered. But ultimately, I'm not so optimistic as I was actually about the culture wars earlier. I think that that you get a level of anti-Semitism in the United Kingdom, which has not been going down, and in some cases, as we see from the Communities Security Trust, gone up. And for all the great good that the chief rabbi does and wants to do, he's like a sort of cork floating on the sea, in my view.
A question from Saul Isroff. He says we could answer together, but I really don't know the answer to this, so I'm going to leave it to you. Please comment on why there seem to be few Jews in the civil service, and particularly in the Foreign Office. The Foreign Office being the tip-off that he's referring to Britain, not the United States.
I'm not sure that's true. I'd like to see the statistics for that. I think that most of the feeders, certainly for both of those two institutions, which are Oxford and Cambridge, tend not to be underrepresented as far as Jews are concerned. So I'm not going to go into it because I'm not absolutely certain it's true. I'd like to see the stats first.
Here in the United States, the State Department for many years was seen as a bastion of anti-Israel sentiment. George Marshall, as Secretary of State to Harry Truman, was the most prominent opponent of US recognition of Israel. And there's a great set to between him and Clark Clifford, then the young aide to Harry Truman, who later became Secretary of Defense, to Lyndon Johnson. Clifford, the young lawyer from Missouri, who made the case for the state of Israel, and Marshall, obviously someone you know well through your study of the Second World War, who made the case against it. But in the last 30 or 40 years, the State Department is certainly well populated by talented Jewish diplomats, ambassadors, secretaries, and so on. Even so, it has generally remained or seen as somewhat more hostile to Israel, or at least on the dovish side of the debates, than other agencies of the U.S. government. If there may be someone watching us who wants to contest that, in which case they should say something to that effect. But that's always been my impression, that Foggy Bottom was never a particularly happy place for Israel advocates. Zachary Narrett asks, how seriously do you consider the threat of anti-Israel activism on the university campus and the spread of such vitriol and hatred? I'm thinking of the scenes of the Israeli ambassador to Great Britain having to be rushed out of the London School of Economics in the face of potentially violent protest.
Nothing potentially about it. It was a very violent protest. Somebody threw half a brick at the back of her car at the LSE. It bounced off, of course, because the Israeli ambassador's car is going to have slightly stronger glass than most people's, but nonetheless, it was a violent protest, and I'm afraid that you see this again and again. The reason that you don't actually see it as much as there could be is because the universities are scared of inviting the Israeli ambassador, and they're scared of her accepting, and the results that can come from it. So I'm afraid there's a horrible sort of self-censorship that takes place, which in a sense, of course, means that the Islamists have won. And when a Jewish society invites the ambassador to come and speak, and either she doesn't because the police don't want her to, or because the university authorities stop it from happening, or the Jewish society itself doesn't want to extend the invitation because they know all the trouble that's going to come from it, not least from Islamists who are other undergraduates, you effectively have a stifling of free speech. And the government's doing something about that. I'm pleased to say in this country, there is a universities bill that is going through Parliament that is designed to prevent all this breaking down of free speech. But for me, the answer is so obvious and so straightforward that I just simply can't understand why universities haven't taken it. Well, I can, because they're such cowards. If you're looking for cowards in society, you look for university authorities. You look for the deans and the presidents of the colleges. They are just spineless when it comes to free speech. But so what they should do, of course, is to send down anyone from a Islamist organization, a Palestinian solidarity campaign organizing group who engages in any viciousness or aggression or violence against anyone. So, if you were able to have a bit tougher stance rather than sort of having an even-handed approach, and actually expelled people from the university so that they will then find it difficult to find a job because people will know that this has happened, then I think you will actually get an awful lot more free speech in our universities. But I see no prospect of that at all because of the totally lily-livered attitude that university authorities have towards this kind of thing.
I can say this as a graduate of the LSE, that the other factor is that it's just not a very good university. But let's.
Well, speaking as a Cambridge graduate, I'm not going to pick you up on that, Bret.
Andrew Neff asks you would enjoy some Churchill stories, but let's narrow Andrew's question down, which is the question of Churchill and Zionism, because Churchill was, in fact, I believe, a committed Zionist from long before the creation of the state of Israel. And yet, during the Second World War, he presided over policies that, in retrospect, were not very friendly to the interests of the Jews in terms of preventing immigration Jewish immigration to Palestine. Could you say a few words about Churchill's position vis-a-vis the Zionist question, particularly when he was in power?
Yes, he was a Zionist. He was a friend of the Jews. He, unlike many upper class people of his generation, his father liked Jews. They went on holiday together.
His father, Randolph.
His father, Lord Randolph Churchill, was friendly with Jews, and Churchill would, in growing up, go on holiday with Jews, which was not that common in the British upper classes, conservative upper classes at the time. He was, of course, a supporter of the Balfour Declaration. He made speeches for the Jews. He sat for 2 Jewish constituencies in his life, or at least predominantly Jewish constituencies in his life. And he had personal friends who were Jewish. And that is unusual for somebody of his background at that time. When he, during the Second World War, and before the Second World War, of course, his philo-Semitism was one of the reasons that he recognized Hitler and the Nazis so early on for what they really were. And therefore
he didn't have a sneaking sympathy for Hitler's
precisely
anti-Semitism.
Exactly. There was none of that at all in his makeup, which there was, I'm afraid, in lots of other people in the Conservative Party at that time. And so it gave him this early warning system for what Hitler and the Nazis were really like. During the war, he supported the creation of the Jewish Brigade against endless problems with the Foreign Office. He told Anthony Eden that he wanted the camps to be, the concentration camps to be bombed, and he said, "Invoke me if necessary." But I'm afraid by that stage of the war, the RAF were doing nighttime raids. It was very much up to the United States to do the daylight raids, which are the only kind of precision raids that you could have against both the railways taking Jews from Hungary to Auschwitz, and also the actual camps themselves. And so it's one of the great tragedies of the 20th century that John McCloy and other decision makers in the American military and administration did not prioritize the bombing of the camps in the way that that only they could. And I'm afraid Anthony Eden also he dragged his feet on this too. So it can't be blamed on Churchill, though. He wasn't a dictator in Britain. If he came up against the combined opposition, as he very often did, especially over the question of immigration to Israel during the war, of the united voice against him in the cabinet, he was not able to get his policy across. So I don't think that that can be blamed on Churchill. I do go into this in some detail in my book, my biography of Churchill. But certainly when in his post-war government, and also in his retirement at the time of Suez and other times, he was personally hugely supportive of the state of Israel.
Andrew, I want to thank you. Your essay is brilliant and important, and I want to thank you also for helping us at SAPIR really launch this publication in the best possible way.